Are there Catholic principles to guide our voting? Stay tuned and see.
Ave Regina Caelorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve radix, salve porta, ex qua mundo luces orta, Gaude Virgo gloriosa, super omnes speciosa.
Welcome to the EWTN Theology Roundtable. I'm your host, Colin Donovan, Vice President for Theology here at EWTN, and I'm here with the Roundtable to discuss the principles of Catholic teaching as they apply to voting in democratic elections. I have put together a distinguished panel, beginning with Father Mitch Pacwa, whom you all know, here for his first time and hopefully not his last.
Thank you.
And also theology staffers Tom Nash and Cindy Cuellar. Now, clearly, the context of our roundtable is the upcoming elections in the United States. But the principles that we will be discussing are those of the Catholic moral theology tradition and would apply in any time and any place. Indeed, many of our sources go back to the early 20th century in terms of the, not the codification of the moral norms, but the collection of the principles underlying the moral norms on this particular issue. And so it's applicable in many countries in any election in the way that Catholics' consciences should be formed in order to guide them in their voting decisions. Now, this brings up the question initially of whether there is a Catholic moral theology tradition on this matter. And as I noted, there are, of course, general principles of Catholic moral teaching regarding the obligation to form the conscience and so on. But also specifically with the advent of democracies beginning in the 1700s, there was a necessity of coming up with the principles by which the individual Christian or Catholic participate in their societies, which are no longer monarchies or aristocracies. And so this is the context in which we're writing. It always is going to get down to then, in deciding how to vote, where are we getting our teaching? What are our sources? Is it the Catholic moral tradition or is it somewhere else? And Father Mitch, this is a very interesting year because both in the presidential election, both vice presidential candidates are Catholics, so there's a lively debate as to who is better founded in terms of their principles of Catholic morality and social teaching. And of course, President Obama is a member of the United Church of Christ, a Christian denomination. And then the interesting question of Mitt Romney, who is a Mormon, which the Catholic Church does not consider to be an Orthodox Christian group, but they consider themselves Christians because of a belief in Christ, the importance of Christ, even if it's not identical to ours. What else can you say about where people are getting their sources of Catholic principles?
There has been a very strong tradition going back to Pope Leo XIII especially, somewhat with Pius IX, dealing with various social issues that and a whole tradition of that is part of, and of course you can go to Thomas and some of the early theologians like Augustine to learn some principles.
The virtue principles and the general principles of the moral law.
Exactly. You know, though the recent popes are dealing with more modern types of governments in their various forms as they arose since the 19th century. And you know, this is something that, Paul Ryan is certainly very explicit in going to those sources. Now, because the sources are diverse, there is very much room for discussion of how he applies those principles. That's what theologians and moralists do.
That's what the voter gets to decide,
exactly.
The extent to which they agree and concur with that.
And every Catholic should examine the sources that Representative Paul Ryan uses. In contrast, though, with some of the issues that we're dealing with, for instance, one that came up, they say by accident, on same-sex marriage as now a plank of the Democratic Party's platform. That was first brought up explicitly in a Sunday morning news program by Vice President Biden.
A Catholic.
A Catholic. But he made no reference to either sacred scripture nor to the catechism or any other source in the fathers and so on, where there is universal rejection of same-sex activity as well as marriage. There would be no question of that. However, he says, and I quote him, "We all learned a lot from Will and Grace." This was a comedy series, I believe in the 90s, early 2000s, in which the humor is based on absolutely rampant narcissism by four characters and the people they interact with. Part of a theme of the comedies of that period was narcissism. And self-centered narcissism was the source that he wants us to use for understanding same-sex marriage, which was very rare in that series. And the president, a couple days, 3 days later, also came out in support of same-sex marriage. And he said, in talking to the friends of my daughters, Sasha and Malia, I came to have more sympathy. Well, moral principles are generally not learned from there. And in fact, he did say in his book, The Audacity of Hope, that he supported same-sex marriage. And he also said when he ran for the Illinois House of State Senate that he signed an agreement supporting it. So he was saying that for public consumption. He had been committed to this on other principles earlier. But certainly, and they would be the principles of his church. They support it, but they're not the principles of all Jews, certainly not the Muslims, and not all Christians.
Yeah, so this, clearly there is, looking at the candidates, they're taking them from rather subjective sources in some cases.
Yes.
And that's an issue of our age, really, which the Pope has been speaking about for years, of relativism. Going back to the 90s, talking about law, how a anthropology of man has been discarded, and so everything is simply the state says something is legal, it is now right as well, and this is one of our issues we're dealing with today.
And he had written in Audacity of Hope and has said since then that the government should not regulate whom people love. I agree. You should love everybody.
You can't regulate whom people love. It's not a switch you can throw.
But the issue isn't whom you love. The issue is the institution of matrimony, which is ordained towards the procreation of children as well as the love of spouses.
Well, you know, in this area, Tom, obviously the church teaches having respect for authority and office holders at every level of government. It's part of bringing order into society that if people individually chose to reject that, then there would be anarchy in a society. But on the other hand, the church also has higher principles that Christians have higher principles to operate according
Sure.
to.
You mentioned about the fact that with regard to being citizens, that being submissive to legitimate authority. Catechism talks about that in 2239. St. Paul speaks about praying for our leaders in his first letter to Timothy, chapter 2. But part of being submissive to legitimate authority is recognizing, hey, is this person doing a good job? Is he upholding the common good? That is he upholding the fundamental dignity and rights of all persons, born and unborn? Well, if he or she is not, then that person needs to be opposed. And how we do that, or support a good candidate, is through our responsibility to vote. And we don't want to, shall we say, abdicate or abandon the political process to those who don't have the common good in mind, because it's like Edmund Burke says, you know, all that evil needs to do to triumph is to have good men do nothing.
And it's part of our obligation as citizens to participate in the society. But ultimately, push comes to shove, Cindy, we may have to make a choice between obeying the civil law and obeying God's law.
Yes, as Tom noted, we as Christians, we have a duty to vote. But what happens when our duties conflict? Well, as Christians, we look to the scriptures, particularly the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 5, verse 29, which teaches that as Christians, we must obey God rather than men. And our U.S. bishops also issued a document entitled Living the Gospel of Life, a challenge to American Catholics, in which they speak of a false pluralism which undermines the moral convictions of Catholics and their obligations to be leaven in society through participation in the democratic process. In this document, particular Article 25, the bishops state, today Catholics risk cooperating in a false pluralism. Secular society will allow believers to have whatever moral convictions they please, as long as they keep them on their private preserves or their consciences, in their homes and in their churches, and out of the public arena. Later they state, only tireless promotion of the truth about the human person can infuse democracy with the right values. This is what Jesus meant when he asked us to be a leaven in society. American Catholics have long sought to assimilate in U.S. cultural life, but in assimilating, we have too often been digested. We've been changed by our culture too much, and we have changed it not enough. And our Holy Father, Pope Benedict, during his last visit to our country in April of 2008, posed this question. He asked, is it consistent to profess our beliefs in church on Sunday, and then during the week to promote business practices or medical procedures contrary to those beliefs?
So we're back to this subjective question that if we admit that pluralism is sort of the highest principle, then that basically says that we have to come to some consensus of values, whereas this is not the way the church has done, and as we'll see later in the program, it's not the way the United States legal system was initially established, that there are underlying principles that all need to respect. And that's going to be an important consideration, I think, probably in our next segment. I think we need to go on to a question what people are probably asking themselves about now as we're only a number of weeks away from the election. And that is, can we say that there is ever a person we may not vote for? A person or a candidate, just to generalize, a candidate for whom voting is either venial sin or mortal sin, or are we entirely free in our decision making, Father Mitch?
See, matter of fact, there's also another question. Is it something that even could be sinful if you don't vote? That taking up that kind of obligation is serious. And, there's certainly going to be issues of what is our goal in making a vote. Why do we choose a certain person? Especially if we choose that person for immoral reasons, and we choose them, for other reasons, or if we put, principles that are non-negotiable, and put those below other issues of prudence. This is where we can be committing, perhaps even venial sin, or in the case of some, if we vote for immorality, then mortal sin.
Yeah, the sin would be according to the kind of the thing
Yes.
that we're favoring.
Right.
A grave matter would involve grave sin to
Right.
support, defend, and give any support to. This is, in fact, something that the moral theology tradition, which I alluded to at the beginning of the program, has spoken about. And this is the tradition. Normally, I think sometimes Catholics think everything comes from the Holy See, comes from the Pope, and I'm waiting for the Pope to say that I can do X, Y, or Z, or not do A, B, and C. In reality, because of the age of the tradition and the way we talked about how Thomas wrote certain things, later other things were written, it builds up over time. And theologians come to a consensus, and that's passed on in the seminaries and in the theology faculties. And the unanimity is rather great among that common theology. And so the church recognizes that most issues are addressed by that theological tradition, and only rarely does the magisterium step in to, say, oppose condemn the opposite opinion when it finds it necessary. And so when we look to ancient authors, whether it's a Buscar, and that's one, or Herbert Joni, a Capuchin, or Henry Davis, who is a member of your community of the Society of Jesus, we're looking not to find magisterial statements so much, but what was commonly taught by all Catholic theologians at that point in time, and which is a foundation on which we stand today. And so Joni said back in 1929, voting is a civic duty which would seem to bind at least under venial sin whenever a good candidate has an unworthy opponent. So you could not vote if it was somewhat irrelevant to the issue, but the obligation begins to take weight by the fact that there is an unworthy candidate who needs to be opposed for the good of the society. And then he goes on to say it might even be mortal sin if one's refusal to vote resulted in the election of an unworthy candidate. And so the point you were making, Father Mitch, about the gravity of the issue can make it gravely wrong not to step in and say, I have to do my part in the society by voting to prevent this or to get a worthier candidate in. And Davis likewise, back in the 30s, talked about the duty of all citizens who have the right to vote to exercise that right for the common good, and that it would be sinful to vote for the enemies of religion or liberty. So he describes two categories of individual: people who are considered enemies of religion, maybe not in capital letters, but they're opposing, they don't have the right notions of religion, they're opposing it, and perhaps even in grave matters, as we'll see. And enemies of an authentic liberty as opposed to an inauthentic freedom and license and so on. So, Tom, what could we say about that first category? What would make somebody an enemy of religion in terms of this theological tradition?
Well, Colin, the Church asks what she has as a right from God, that is to ask any society, any government to fulfill its mission, to evangelize, to make disciples of all nations. Now, an enemy of religion would say, no, we're going to oppose you from fulfilling your mandate. We see this particularly in Islamic countries where you have your freedom of worship, but don't go outside those four walls of your church.
And you can't build a church, and you're a great number of constrictions on you.
Exactly. And you can't, for example, Father Mitch couldn't wear his collar, his clerical garb in public. But there's also cases as well where you can coerce the consciences of people in society, men and women, whereby you basically coerce them to adhere to the state as their highest, give the state their highest allegiance over and against their rightly formed consciences. So, for example, you can talk about the HHS mandate, where you're supposed to do this, you're supposed to provide this health care, even though you as a Catholic employer, you as a Catholic entity are opposed to such.
And with huge penalties, as Mike Warsaw made note of on the air a number of weeks ago, $12 million ultimately for EWTN
That's
per
a big
year
chill.
if we don't. They sometimes talk about restricting pornography because it might chill freedom of speech, but nobody seems to be chilled by massive fines on Catholic charitable and apostolic organizations.
But it puts a chill, or attempts to put a chill on the church. Hey, how much do you want to pay a price for your practicing religion?
And Cindy, quickly, we have about a minute remaining in this segment. What would be an enemy of authentic liberty?
Well, that's one who attacks the most basic rights upon which all others depend. What are these basic rights? First and foremost, the right to life. Deprivation of life takes away all other rights. And secondly, marriage. The attack on marriage undermines the basic cell of society. So if children don't have a stable family life, we probably aren't going to have stable adult personalities participating in a mature way in a society.
And we're finding that to be the case. Sociologists are discovering the degree to which abandonment of families by men, initially only in black communities, but now in large numbers among Caucasians and other races as well, and the influences on criminality and homelessness and other factors. Very often the women and the children suffer that the most. So clearly attacks on the family or effects upon the family are a great danger to a society. Well, we're going to take a break now, and when we come back, we'll continue to talk about these kinds of attacks on religion and upon liberty, and we'll begin with what Pope Benedict had to say in this matter.
Deporta quam uno luces orta, Cade Virgo gloriosa super Regina Celorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve radix, salve porta.
We've been talking about two categories of candidates that Christians should not vote for when there is an alternative, when there is someone who would be more worthy. And those two categories, which come out of the moral theology tradition spoken of in authors like Heribert Joni, Henry Davis Buscarin, and others, are enemies of religion and enemy of liberty. And Pope Benedict actually spoke along these same lines, clearly showing a point I made in the last segment, that these things go along fine in the church until they're opposed, and then at this point the magisterium tends to take a stronger hand, make stronger statements. And you will see the coincidence between what these other moral theology authors have said and what Pope Benedict XVI said. And he said it to a European parliamentary group that he addressed in Rome in March of 2006. And he noted that as far as the Catholic Church is concerned, the principal focus of her interventions in the public arena is the protection and promotion of the dignity of the person, and she is thereby consciously drawing particular attention to principles which are not negotiable. Among these are the following emerge clearly today: protection of life in all its stages from the first moment of conception until natural death, recognition of promotion of the natural structure of the family as a union between a man and a woman based on marriage, and its defense from attempts to make it juridically equivalent to radically different forms of union which in reality harm it and contribute to its destabilization, obscuring its particular character and its irreplaceable social role, and the protection of the right of persons to educate their children. So there we basically are seeing opposition to the moral law, to the authentic nature of man, to the proper liberty of individuals. Obviously, parents have the right to educate their children based on their religious liberty, based on their free speech rights, based on right of assembly, you might even say. The First Amendment would be key in the American context, understanding that. And I think, Cindy, the first two of those are very, we would say, anthropological. In other words, it's about the nature of man as he really is. And that's the protection of innocent life and marriage and family life.
Yes, the protection of innocent human life is not a sectarian position on the part of the Catholic Church. Our founding documents recognize the first obligation of government is the protection of innocent human life. In the U.S. Constitution, we also have federal oaths. For instance, I swear to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States against all its enemies, both foreign and domestic. So the protection of life and goods and all that goes with it is the first obligation of government. And we also have local governments, and that they're involved in protection against criminals. And on the issue of marriage, that also is key, because government must foster the lifelong commitment of a man and a woman to each other and to their children. And most of society's problems today derive from the failure of government, churches, synagogues, media, and academia to do this.
So you really have this position, I think, which of course Father Mitch is well founded, as Cindy noted, in our founding documents, that this is not a sectarian position of the church. We would say this is based on natural law. And I remember something that then Cardinal Ratzinger said in the early 90s discussing this. He made note of the fact that among the constitutions of the democratic nations, the Constitution of the United States and the founding intentions in the United States hold much closer to the Church's view of the natural law than, say, some European constitutions. Mm-hmm. And so we really have a particular obligation, I think, not only as American citizens, but as Christians, to defend those principles. And religious liberty is at the foundation of all of that.
You know, I think some of the European constitutions have in mind that the church had been a political power and they wanted to exclude it in various countries. Our approach in the United States was the representatives who came to sign the Declaration of Independence were from a wide variety of religious communities. There were Quakers, Puritans, Congregationalists, Baptists, Catholics,
John Carroll,
Anglicans. You know, all these different groups wanted to include everybody, and so they went to a basic principle that all could hold. They said in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created. They recognized creation as not being self-creation, but that they go on to say that they are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
And there's two of our things right there, life and liberty, without which you can't pursue happiness.
Exactly. And you know that these are rooted in their mind, in God the Creator, and they are given to each individually directly by God, not mediated through the state. And that was a basic principle in the Declaration. Also in the Constitution, as it begins in its preamble, that we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain this Constitution. Within that Constitution, they got the structure of the government and the first articles and so on, but they concluded the Constitution with a Bill of Rights. The first Bill of Right begins with this principle that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. First right that's in the Bill of Rights is freedom of religion, and that Congress can't establish one, nor can it interfere, as it has done in the Health and Human Services mandate. And so, and then of course, it guarantees freedom of speech and the press, which for us would be eliminated if we are fined into non-existence because we don't comply with breaking our religious principles, when the government forces us to commit mortal sin of abortion, contraception, and sterilization. And then the right of the people to peaceably assemble or petition the government for redress of grievances. Those are basic principles.
And clearly, again, the coincidence with the principles of the Catholic moral theology tradition, which are natural law principles, which, yes, divine revelation affirms those and makes them, as theologians would say, makes them generally knowable, because sometimes people don't foresee or appreciate all of the moral law. But revelation and the Church's teaching makes the moral law in its entirety knowable and available to all people. And so the Founding Fathers understood that. They read Catholic authors, they read philosophical authors, both Catholic and non-Catholic, who put these principles forward.
Even some of the Protestant authors that they read, and George Washington in particular, were based on principles written by Jesuits who were reflecting on Thomas Aquinas.
Robert Bellarmine, I think, was a big influence on the thinking of those the late 1700s. Well, these non-negotiable principles you can contrast with negotiable. If there's non-negotiables, there's negotiables. There is in moral theology in our Catholic tradition the idea that when you have to apply more than a single principle, such as single principle, all innocent human life deserves our absolute respect. Multiple principles, justice, subsidiary, participation, solidarity. When you start to apply multiple principles, you're into a prudential judgment. And so the negotiable things are prudential judgment. Most government policies and laws are a balancing of principles. And therefore, you cannot say, you could say the extremes are not coincident with Catholic teaching, but in the middle, there's a great room for agreement and disagreement. But again, Tom, there's one thing you can't do, and that is say, well, as Father Mitch mentioned earlier, you can't put the negotiables above the non-negotiables in importance.
No, I mean, for example, say I like the candidate A because of his position on the economy or how he helps the poor. Well, there's different ways to approach those issues, as you say, but yet at the same time, ignore the fact that this person does not uphold the right to life, whether it's the unborn and abortion or euthanasia, or with regard to family. You know, we didn't even have this whole issue of same-sex marriage until the mid-90s, even President Clinton at that time. We saw that the Defense of Marriage Act, because even though things have been going not great with the family, it's only because of the decline of the family, authentic marriage, that this has even become an issue in our country. So we're speaking about the degrade of morality in that regard, that this has even become an issue, same-sex marriage. But it makes no sense for someone to say, gee, my candidate's anti-life, you know, for abortion, euthanasia, my candidate's anti-marriage, same-sex marriage, but he still stands for, in accordance with Catholic social teaching, Catholic social principles. It's like the Pope said in Evangelium Vitae, it's a grave distortion of truth to speak of a right to abortion or right to euthanasia.
I remember about 20 years ago in Louisiana, there was a very notable racist candidate, a Supreme Knight of the Ku Klux Klan. Well, I was going to mention his name, but a Supreme Knight of the Ku Klux Klan, and he ran for an election. It would be like saying, well, I know this person is a racist, but on all these other issues, I trust his judgment on how to treat people, on what the poor need, on what social services need, how the schools should be run. We would say that's totally absurd, but yet this is the balance people are trying to make sometimes by holding abortion in this hand and good wage policies or good social policies in the other, and saying, aha, I can vote for poor.
Or the proverbial, he makes the trains run on time, so that's good enough for me, you know. Right,
you can get into a whole bunch of historical analyses there. I think this brings us to sort of the crux of the issue today, and that is there seems to be two worldviews at work in politics today. And we did a little study of the party platforms of the two major parties. Of course, there are minor parties, communists and socialists of different stripes, and even I think there's even a green party, an environmental party. But in the United States, we have principally the two major parties. And so we looked at those and we made a comparison with the platforms of the principles of the moral law. Now, platforms are platforms. I think American voters understand that is represents sort of an ideal opinion. It's sometimes the candidates adhere to, whether more firmly or more weakly among themselves. But it does give you something by which to measure candidates against, and once they're elected, their performance, because it tells you what is the objective of this candidate party. What are they trying to accomplish through the instrument of politics? And there is, St. Thomas talks about political prudence. He actually calls it the highest prudence, because what greater thing can you do, obviously, other than in the church and the sacramental life, but help a society advance and form and provide for the citizens of a society. And so it's a very high office, and the platforms show us what they are thinking of when they seek that office and what they will try to accomplish when they're in that office. So Cindy, why don't you take the issues of life and marriage and read the little excerpts from the two platforms, and we can get through this, I think, fairly quickly. I will say this will be on EWTN's website in the EWTN document library, and you'll be able to find it there searching under the word platform.
Yes, on the issue of life, the 2012 Democratic platform states, the Democratic Party strongly and unequivocally supports Roe versus Wade and a woman's right to make decisions regarding her pregnancy, including a safe and legal abortion regardless of ability to pay. We oppose any and all efforts to weaken or undermine that right. The 2012 Republican platform states, "Faithful to the self-evident truths enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, we assert the sanctity of human life and affirm that the unborn child has a fundamental individual right to life which cannot be infringed. We support a human life amendment to the Constitution and endorse legislation to make clear that the 14th Amendment's protections apply to unborn children." On the issue of marriage, the Democratic platform states, "We support marriage equality and support the movement to secure equal treatment under law for same-sex couples. We support the full repeal of the so-called Defense of Marriage Act." The 2012 Republican platform states, "We reaffirm our support for a constitutional amendment defining marriage as a union of one man and one woman."
And Tom, on the third of our non-negotiables, authentic human freedom, what do the two platforms say?
Basically, you talk about the first freedom, includes religious freedom, and when we speak about freedom, we're talking about authentic freedom, that which is bound by truth and exercised within a moral framework, even aside from religion, because you mentioned the natural law. But the Democratic platform says the President and the Democratic Party believe that women have a right to control their reproductive choices. Democrats support access to affordable family planning services, and President Obama and Democrats will continue to stand up to Republican efforts to defund Planned Parenthood health centers. The Affordable Care Act ensures that women have access to contraception in their health insurance plans. The 2012 Republican platform says, "We support the ability of all organizations to provide, purchase, or enroll in health care coverage consistent with their religious, moral, or ethical convictions without discrimination or penalty." They go on to say, with regard to religious freedom, religious minorities across the Middle East are being driven from their ancient homelands. Fanaticism leaves its bloody mark on both West and East Africa, and even among America's Western friends and allies, pastors and families are penalized for their religious convictions. We will return the advocacy of religious liberty to a central place in our diplomacy.
So there we have this comparison of the two platforms against the three non-negotiable principles which Pope Benedict talked about, which the moral theology tradition in authors that predate our times by decades, if not centuries, in terms of the roots of all of those principles. And that's an analysis and comparison then that can be made and on these issues, because these are the three most important issues, because the future, the good, the common good of society depends upon the respect for human dignity that these non-negotiables enshrine and defend. This brings us, Father Mitch, we were talking earlier about who we shouldn't vote for. We can say that, as you intimated, that we can find ourselves in a situation where we must vote. Well, we must vote if there's true issues are there, not an irrelevancy, but we can find ourselves morally obliged to vote for a particular purpose. And I think this is what troubles a lot of people today. They're not happy with candidates, but yet they see a duty there and they don't know where to go.
Yeah, a number of people want to opt out of voting because they don't care for either candidate and so on. However, one of the keys, again, we quoted before from Herbert Ioni in his Moral Theology book, that we need to vote for a good candidate when there is an unworthy opponent. This is a moral obligation. And it could even be a mortal sin if your refusal to vote would result in the election of an unworthy candidate. That's a clear position. Father Davis had said something similar, that it is sinful to vote for the enemies of religion or liberty, except when you have to exclude an even worse candidate. So sometimes you have two candidates who are neither really supporting everything in terms of the moral principles, and you have to evaluate who's going to support more of the non-negotiable principles, than the other person and make that choice.
I think, too, we raised this earlier a little bit regarding the question of religion. One of the presidential candidates, Mitt Romney, is a Mormon. The Catholic Church does not consider Mormonism to be Christian because it doesn't have the idea of the Trinity and the Incarnation and redemption and quite in the same understanding of as the Catholic Church and the mainstream churches. But what do people who are bothered about, well, I can't vote for a non-Christian? What do you do in that kind of a situation?
You know, we're in a difficult situation. You know, a core difference of the belief is that, you know, their concept of God is different than ours. For them, creation is eternal. God is born of previous gods all the way on back. So God is not the creator. This is problematic. But we also see that in President Obama's denomination, the United Church of Christ, that in the interest of various political issues, they have also changed their concept of God. So, for instance, they have multiple formulae for baptism that would be also quite heretical by the standards of standard Christian teaching. In order to accommodate, so that they don't do it in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, they considered that politically incorrect. So they offered other alternatives of the Creator, Redeemer, Sanctifier, which is the heresy of modalism.
In which a number of years ago, when some Catholic priests were doing that, Rome said those children were not baptized.
Exactly.
It was invalid.
Exactly, it's an invalid baptism.
Yeah.
And also the United Church of Christ teaches that same-sex marriage is morally acceptable, and they are strong in supporting what they consider a woman's right to an abortion. This is on their website. So, you know, whereas the Mormon Church supports marriage between a man and a woman and is strongly against abortion. So on moral issues, we have more in agreement with the Mormon Church than we would with the official teaching of the United Church of Christ. And we have differences of theology with both of them at core issues of who God is. So we should not, again, then say that therefore I can't vote for either one. I still must make a vote based on the natural law principles and, you know, who is going to give the best and clearest statement of moral teaching that we can agree with.
Yeah. And sure, we would all feel very, very comfortable and very happy if, wow, there's a Catholic presidential candidate. He agrees with the church on everything within our system of government. He will try to affect and restore the I mean, we'd all be happy to have such a person to vote for. We don't have such a person running for president, at least. And so what we have to make is a decision about, you know, is one of these guys the lesser evil? And I think that's an important moral principle that Catholics use in many, many circumstances. Choosing something, making choices where we can't see necessarily a straight path, but we can see that one choice would be worse than the other.
Yeah, the principle of the lesser evil is a bit of a misnomer because what we're really talking about is choosing the better of two imperfect candidates. For example, on abortion, one person, a man or a woman, may be for abortion on demand, that is abortion in all circumstances, where someone else, candidate B, would be the rape, incest, and the so-called life of the mother exception. Well, similar to the gospel of life, which John Paul II says, a candidate who is authentically pro-life can vote for the reduction in abortion, even though there's going to be exceptions allowed, because he's taking the abortion on demand and reducing it. So too with the candidate in this case, you choose the one who's more pro-life, more for the family. As Father Mitch was saying, the better of the best of the two.
Okay, we've been talking about the lesser evil, and when we come back, we'll continue our discussion on Catholic principles of voting.
Salve radix, salve porta, Regina Celorum, Ave Domina Angelorum.
Okay, we were talking about the lesser evil, which is really the choice of the good of limiting the evil that would be done by another candidate. There is also the issue, I think, that some people are concerned about, and that is, well, am I not guilty for the decisions that the politician will make once he's elected? And the church deals with this under two titles, formal cooperation and material cooperation. Formal cooperation means we embrace the actual evil position of an individual or the evil act of another. So we don't say, we could not say, well, I'm personally opposed to abortion, but yet I'm going to, it's fine that there are abortions, because that's a disconnect mentally, morally. It says that my opinion is that abortion is okay, I just wouldn't have one myself or something of this nature. So we may not formally cooperate in that way in the advance of abortion or gay marriage or attacks on religious liberty. But materially, we may elect somebody, we may provide financial support, we may give our vote to an individual who we're trying to limit the evil that the other candidate does by electing his opponent. But with the result that, well, the person we elect does things that we don't like or holds positions that we do not agree with. That's called material cooperation, and it's justifiable for a reason sufficiently grave. And the grave reason in the case of electing is to prevent the election of a candidate who will do far more harm. So that's the justifying reason. But I think there is another factor here that we have to consider in our day. It's a factor that is in the social teaching more than we think of it in terms of the poor or financial systems or whatever. And that's the idea of structures of sin. When people come together in association for similar evil purposes, they create a structure of sin, an organization, a financial institution, or even a political party whose purpose is largely or essentially or centrally to advance particularly grave evils. And in that case, we need to sever our association with them because we become formal cooperators in the evil that they do. And I think this is something that in our day we need to think about. If an organization is advancing grave evils, and to be an effective member of that organization, to be in a leadership position of that organization, even to vote for candidates of the organization, I must effectively advance the central purposes of that organization, to advance abortion or to protect abortion, to advance gay marriage or to make it possible, or to oppose religious liberty, which is contrary to my particular organization's viewpoints. Then we have to ask ourselves, are we not formally cooperating in a structure of sin that needs to be, rather than built up, that needs to be tore down? And I think we are at a point in time where a number of bishops have said this, a number of theologians have said it. I've said it on Open Line a couple times. We need to consider whether we are not assisting a structure of sin for motivations, what we've talked about here, that are, well, I love what they say on the negotiables, and it doesn't matter to me that on the non-negotiables, they are advancing, promoting, and only allowing those who hold similar views to have any effective role in the running of that organization. I think, Father, people still have various kinds of doubts about their voting, some of which are justifiable and can be corrected, and others not necessarily so. And theologians speak of the categories of a sincere doubt versus a doubt based on scrupulosity.
Yeah, scrupulosity has two elements. One of them is fairly emotional, that a person, feels uncomfortable, and say in the support of an imperfect candidate, you would feel uncomfortable. But you can't vote just on how you feel and let your feeling paralyze you. You have to vote on what is true. This requires us to think clearly. Secondly, scrupulosity is also based on pride, that I'm held to a higher standard than everybody else. and I can't be less than absolutely perfect. And that pride is not going to help promote the improvement of society. Many imperfect steps get taken to make society better. My mother said that when she was raising me.
And we always have to remember we're not God, we're not omniscient, so we make fallible decisions. It's part of our human nature, our fallen human nature, that we do so. But we just simply make the best decision we can in the moment, in the circumstances of the day, and in this case, to vote for the candidate who is more likely to protect the values that are greatest in our society. I think sometimes people wonder, well, what if I do a protest vote, or my conscience won't let me vote for such and such a person that others are saying I should vote for? Can we ever make a conscience vote, really?
I think you have to analyze the situation, Colin. You have to have a well-formed conscience. You have to know the candidates, but you got to look at the situation. What's the likelihood going to be? You have two problematic candidates. Maybe you have a pro-life candidate, a pro-life party in a particular state. It's quite clear, perhaps, that the pro-abortion candidate's going to win, no matter what. So you give that, so that 10% will show that, hey, this is where the pointing toward the pro-life candidate, where the pro-abortion candidate, radical pro-abortion candidate's going to win. You might argue for that. However, there are many cases where if the less problematic candidate gets sufficient support, it's better to go with him, because what happens is, instead of getting an imperfect candidate, you end up, by going with the protest vote, you in effect give a vote to the most radically pro-abortion candidate, and therefore your protest vote has backfired.
That's right. You have to, it's all circumstantial. You have to be prudent in the circumstances and be rational. Which decision will advance the common good? Not 5, 10, 25 years, which you can't foresee. We're not God. But right now, which is likely, and we're not God, which is likely to lead to the better outcome. I think it's worthwhile to mention now, before we close up the show, that we have a number of resources, or there are a number of resources available to you to read further on these issues. Bishop Olmsted of Phoenix recently gave a pastoral letter, which is available on the website of the Diocese of Phoenix, diocesephoenix.org. And also, he spoke on a religious liberty panel at our family celebration in Phoenix, and that DVD is available from Religious Catalog, and that item number will be on the screen. There is also this document on the political party platforms, as I mentioned, that will be in EWTN's document library. And finally, there is a truly great voter's guide put out by a Catholic Hispanic organization, the Catholic Voters Education Guide, that is available on their website, catholichispanic.org. So we can highly recommend all of those resources. Father Mitch, did you have any closing thoughts for us on this situation today?
This is certainly a very complicated election, where there are a wide variety of complex issues and various imperfections. But let us do the best we can to promote life and liberty and family. This is a great task, and part of one that will continue on long after this election.
And with that, we'll thank you for tuning in, and go out, pray, and vote wisely. God bless.
Ave Regina Caelorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve radix, salve porta, ex qua mundo luces orta, Cade Virgo gloriosa, super omnes speciosa, Vale o vale Dei ora, et pro nobis Christum exora.
Dignare me laudare te, Virgo Sacrata,